Good afternoon. I am Dr Poonam Rani, tutor, Department of Physiology, SKMCH. Today we will be discussing about functional properties of receptors. What is receptor? Receptors are specialized modified nerve ending which undergoes depolarization in response to a specific stimulus and sends information to the CNS. Why we must study about receptors? We know that information of the outside world and changes occurring within the body itself has to be conveyed to the CNS, and this is done by a variety of sensory receptors via the sensory nerve impulses. What are the functions of receptors? Receptors are transducers, that is, they convert various forms of energy in the environment into electrical energy. What are the different forms of energy that are converted? These are the mechanical energy as touch and pressure, thermal energy, electromagnetic or light energy, and chemical energy. Chemical energy is coming from the smell, taste, oxygen and carbon dioxide content of the blood. What is sense organs? Receptors along with the surrounding non-neuronal cells is called a sense organ. Coming to the stimulus. What is stimulus? Stimulus is an event or particular form of energy that evokes a specific functional reaction in an organ or receptor. The term sensory unit means sensory axon and all its peripheral branches. The receptive field of a sensory neuron is the particular part of the body surface in which a stimulus will trigger the firing of that neuron. Having done our general information, let's come to the classification of receptors. As we know, receptors are used in various different types of meaning, such as this sensory receptors, and also the receptors we study that proteins that bind to neurotransmitters and hormones. But whenever you are asked about receptors, you will study or tell about sensory receptors. Coming to the classification, is done in three types according to the type of stimulus, general or anatomical classification, and according to the type of receptors. According to the type of stimulus, there are 5 types of receptors, that are mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, nociceptors, electromagnetic receptors, and chemoreceptors. Mechanical receptors perceive touch, pressure, vibration, and acceleration. Receptors that perceive touch and pressure is also known as baroreceptors. Chemoreceptors perceive the changes in chemical composition of the environment in which receptors are located, such as receptors for taste, smell, osmoreceptors, and glucoreceptors. Thermoreceptors perceive the change in warmth or the degree of warmth. Nociceptors, these are stimulated when there is noxious stimulus, that is, stimuli which are damaging or injurious to the body, that is, pain. Photoreceptors perceive electromagnetic energy, that is, light, and this light is perceived by rods and cones in retina. Now coming to the next Way of classification, that is general or anatomical classification. By the general or anatomical classification, there are four types of receptors, that are special senses, superficial or cutaneous senses, deep senses, and visceral senses. Special senses, these are located at one place very close to the CNS and are specialized for one type of sensory stimulation. Information by these senses are carried by cranial nerves. Example, vision, hearing, smell, taste, rotational and linear acceleration. Superficial or cutaneous senses. These senses, whose receptors are located in the skin, are called cutaneous senses. Information in them is carried by cutaneous branches of the spinal nerve. Example is touch, pain, pressure, and thermal reception. Deep senses. These senses are carried by the muscular branches of the spinal or cranial nerve from deep body tissues. Example, sensation of joints, muscles, and tendons. Visceral senses. These senses are concerned with perception of internal environment and are carried by the autonomic nervous system. Example is pain from visceral structures and concentration of glucose in blood. The major sensory modalities can be divided in two parts, conscious senses and unconscious senses. Senses which reach the consciousness are conscious senses. That is, all special and superficial senses which are transmitted to the brain in conscious state is called conscious senses. What about unconscious senses? These senses play without our knowing. That is, sensory receptors which relay information that does not reach consciousness. For example, the receptors which relay information about muscle length, muscle tension, arterial blood pressure, central venous pressure, inflation of lungs, temperature of blood, arterial PO2, pH of CSF, and many more. Now coming to the classification to the type of receptor. Type of receptors. These this classification is according to Serrington classification. There are three types of receptors: teleceptors, exteroceptors, and interoceptors. Teleceptors, these are the receptors which are concerned with sensory perception at a distance. Example, hearing, vision, and smell. Exteroceptors, these receptors are concerned with perception of external environment. Example, touch, temperature, pain, and pressure. What about interoceptors? Interoceptors respond to changes in our own body. Now these interoceptors are divided further into three parts: proprioceptors, visceroceptors, and chemoreceptors. Proprioceptors give information about changes in the body, in space, especially the joints or tension of the muscle at any given moment. These receptors include muscle spindles, joint receptors, Golgi tendon organs, and vestibuloreceptors. Visceroreceptors, these are the baroreceptors, osmoreceptors, and glucoreceptors. While chemoreceptors, these perceive the oxygen and carbon dioxide content. Immediate pain via the small C unmyelinated or myelinated A delta afferent neurons. The tactile mechanoreceptors can be further divided in two parts: encapsulated or non-encapsulated. Encapsulated tactile mechanoreceptors are Meissner corpuscles in dermal papilla, Pacinian corpuscles in dermis, ligaments, joint capsules, and Ruffini's end organs in dermis and in deeper tissues. While non-encapsulated tactile mechanoreceptors are free nerve endings in dermis, ligaments, cornea, and bones, hair and organs in hairy skin, and Merkel's discs in non-hairy and hairy skin. Types of sensory receptors and the sensory stimuli they detect are free nerve endings, expanded tip receptors, tactile hair receptors, Ruffini's end organs, Golgi tendon apparatus, Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner's corpuscles, cross corpuscles, and muscle spindle. These pictures depict the different types of receptors in different areas of the skin. Now coming to the electrical and ionic events in receptors. The electrical events and receptors are usually studied by selecting Pacinian corpuscles. Why? Because they are relatively large in size. They are easily available in the mesentery of experimental animals and they can be isolated, subjected to microdissection and studied with microelectrodes. The Pacinian corpuscles consist of the following parts. They have a straight unmyelinated ending of a sensory nerve fiber, 2 micrometer in diameter, which is surrounding by concentric lamellas of connective tissue. The myelin sheath of the sensory nerve begins inside the corpuscle. Therefore, the first node of Ranvier is located just inside and the second node just outside the corpuscle. What is the mechanism of natural excitation? That is generator potential. The Pacinian corpuscle can be stimulated mechanically by a rod which produces local potential changes. When the small amount of pressure is applied, a non-propagated depolarization potential or EPSP is recorded. This is called the generated potential or receptor potential. As the pressure is increased, the magnitude of the receptor potential increases. When the magnitude of the generator potential is above 10 millivolt, an action potential is generated in the sensory nerve. This action potential is, as the pressure is further increased, generator potential becomes even larger and the sensory nerve fires repetitively. The source of the generator potential can be demonstrated from the study of the experiment after removal of the connective tissue lamellae or by blockage of first node of Ranvier. Now see how the action potential is produced in sensory nerve. The generator potential depolarizes the sensory nerve at the first node of Ranvier. Once the firing level is reached, an action potential is produced and the membrane depolarizes. If the generator potential is great enough, the neuron fires again as soon as it depolarizes and it continues to fire as long as the generator potential is large enough to bring the membrane potential of the first node of Ranvier to the firing level. Thus, the first node of Ranvier converts the graded response of the receptor into action potential. The receptor therefore converts the mechanical energy into an electrical energy, the magnitude of which is proportional to the intensity of the stimulus. Relationship between the intensity of the stimulus, the size of generator potential and frequency of action potential in the afferent nerve. The magnitude of the generator potential is directly proportional to the intensity of a stimulus. That is, greater the intensity of the applied stimulus, larger will be the magnitude of the generator potential. There also exists a relationship between the magnitude of generator potential and the frequency of action potential in the sensory nerve. That is, frequency of action potential in a sensory nerve is also directly proportional to the magnitude of the generator potential. Based on these facts, Weber and Fechner proposed two different laws, Weber's law and Fechner's law. Weber's law, Weber's law states that just a noticeable difference between two stimuli is proportional to the magnitude of the stimuli, while Fechner's law states that subjective sensation is proportional to the logarithm of the stimulus intensity. By combining the two laws, we get the Weber-Fechner law, which states that stimulus varies as a geometric progression and the corresponding perception is altered in an arithmetic progression. The relationship is dp equal to k multiplied by ds by s, where dp is differential change in perception, ds is differential increase in stimulus, while s is the stimulus at that instant, and k is the constant factor. The stimulus initiates an increase in the permeability of the membrane of an unmyelinated terminal to sodium. The resultant influx of sodium causes development of a generator potential. The magnitude of change in permeability of the membrane is proportional to the intensity of the stimulus. How does the mechanical stimulus brings about change in membrane permeability? It is due to stretching or distortion of the membrane, or it could be due to release of some chemical mediators. Now coming to the properties of receptors. What is the specificity of response or law of adequate stimulus? Receptors respond maximally only when an appropriate specific stimulus is applied. That is, warm water stimulates raffinase receptors at low intensity. However, at high intensity, it also stimulates the naked nerve endings of pain. Adequate stimulus for rods and cones in eye is light. Pressure also stimulates these receptors, but the threshold is much higher. Tactile receptors respond to deformation. Golgi tendon organs are stimulated by stretch. Cochlea responds to vibration of basement membrane set up by the sound at much lower threshold of stimulus. Now what is adaptation? Adaptation means when a stimulus of constant strength is applied to the receptor, the frequency of action potential in its sensory nerve decreases over a period of time. This phenomenon is called adaptation or desensitization. There are two types of receptors based on adaptation: tonic receptors and phasic or rate receptors. Tonic receptors have poor, slow, or incompletely adapting receptors. These continue to transmit the information for long hours, even if the intensity of the stimulus remains constant over many days. Examples are muscle spindle adaptation is slow, sensation of pain and cold. Baroreceptors and chemoreceptors do not undergo adaptation. This is important for life because if these receptors get adapted, it will damage the body. How? The muscle spindle adaptation is slow. The muscle discharge continues as long as the muscle is stretched. This is particularly helpful in prolonged postural adjustment. Sensation of pain and cold are initiated by potentially noxious stimuli, and they would lose some of their warning values if their receptor shows marked adaptation. Baroreceptors and chemoreceptors operate continuously in the regulation of BP. Adaptation of these receptors would limit the precision with which the regulatory system operates. Phasic or rate receptors. These are rapidly adapting receptors and transmit signal only when the stimulus strength changes. Thus, the number of impulse transmitters is directly proportional to the rate at which change takes place. Examples are touch, olfactory, and pressure receptors. Now, the Muller's doctrine of a specific nerve energy. What does it mean? This means that is, action potential is similar in all nerves. Then why there is a difference in perception? This is because sensation produced by impulses generated in receptors depend upon the specific part of the brain they ultimately activate. This principle was first established by Muller and so is called Muller's doctrine of specific nerve energy. Therefore, when the nerve pathways from a particular sense organs are stimulated, the sensation produced is that for which the receptor is specialized, no matter how or where along the pathway the activity is originated. This explains why activation of pain pathways by the pressure of a growth in the spinal cord results in the perception of pain. Law of projection. No matter where a particular sensory pathway is stimulated along its course to the cortex, the conscious sensation produced is referred to the location of the receptor. This forms the theory of phantom limb. For example, a limb that has been lost by accident or amputation. The patient usually experiences intolerable pain and proprioceptive sensation in that limb that is no longer present. So it is called phantom limb. Phantom means non-existing or absent limb. These sensations are due to irritation of the damaged nociceptive and proprioceptive afferents at the stump of the removed limb. This generates impulses in the nerve fiber that previously came from the receptors in the removed limb, and the sensation produced are projected to where the receptor used to be located. Phantom sensation may also occur after the removal of other body parts, as such amputation of breast or extraction of a tooth. Last but not the least is the law of intensity discrimination. How the brain perceives the difference in intensities. That is, how it is possible to tell whether the touch is light or heavy, pain is mild, moderate, or severe. There are two ways in which information about intensity of a stimuli is transmitted to the brain. That is, variation in frequency of action potential generated and by variation in the number of receptors activated. As the strength of a stimulus is increased, it spreads over a large area, activating more and more receptors in the neighborhood. That is called recruitment of sensory units. In addition, with weak stimuli, only receptors with low threshold fire, whereas with stronger stimuli, receptors with higher threshold also fire. Thus, more afferent pathways get activated, which is interpreted in brain as increase in intensity of the sensation. Intensity determination is determined primarily by the properties of the peripheral receptors. Thank you.